You're watching VinylicPumaGaming. Hey guys, back with another Fallout 4 theory video, and a couple of you asked that I talk about the state of Europe and Russia in the comments section in my last theory video. So today I figured I'd talk about both Europe and Russia, as the backstory behind each is really interesting. Now, as a quick disclaimer, while there isn't a whole lot we know about either region, we do know a little bit, as has been explained in some of the previous games in the series. And as always, this video will get into some speculation, and that's always fun. So without further ado, let's jump on in and discuss pre-war Europe. Before the events of the Fallout games began, Europe's various countries were united into one state-like entity known as the European Commonwealth. As you can imagine, this is very similar to the European Union from our very own real world. Now, we don't know all of the countries that were a part of the European Commonwealth, but what we do know is that the United Kingdom and France were definitely members in the Fallout universe. In our real world, other notable countries like Sweden, Ireland, Germany, Spain, Italy, and Poland may or may not have been a part of the European Commonwealth in the Fallout universe. However, with that said, Irish characters like Kate from Fallout 4 and Colin Moriarty from Fallout 3 do appear in the games, and Stanislaus Braun from Vault 112 and Fallout 3 was born in pre-war Germany. Still, there's not really a whole lot we know about each individual European Commonwealth member, so there's a possibility some countries that we associate with our real-world European Union aren't members. What we do know is that quite a few of the famous firearms manufacturers from our real world do appear to have existed in the Fallout universe and may have perhaps been a part of the European Commonwealth. For example, the German company Heckler & Koch developed the 10mm SMG from Fallout 3 in New Vegas. The Belgian company FN Herstal developed the FAL rifle in Fallout 2, and the Austrian company Glock is responsible for the Plasma Defender pistol that appears in Fallout New Vegas. What we do know for sure is that the European Commonwealth definitely did fight in the resource wars like the United States and China. In fact, the Europeans and the Middle East were among the first groups to fight in these wars. Europe was heavily dependent on oil imports from the Middle East. Middle Eastern countries knew this and thus increased their prices, and, of course, in response, European powers responded with military force in April 2052. This conflict would become known as the Euro-Middle Eastern War. During 2052 and 2053, both Europe and the Middle East would fight each other until December of 2053, when a nuclear weapon destroys Tel Aviv in Israel. In January 2054, a small nuclear exchange in the region caused great concern among the global community. This even led to the United States initiating Project SAFEHOUSE, a project that involved the Vault-Tec Corporation to construct underground shelters so some of the United States population would survive nuclear Armageddon. By the year 2060, the Euro-Middle Eastern War came to an end as a result of the Middle Eastern oil fields running dry. As a result, both sides ceased fighting, and European forces returned home to fight amongst themselves for the remaining oil supply. This European Civil War ultimately would leave much of the European Commonwealth in ruins before the Great War happened, leaving the region in bad shape before the bombs fell in October 2077. Russia, however, is a little bit more mysterious. Unsurprisingly, we don't really know a whole lot about Russia. However, we do know that they were still the Soviet Union based on previous games lore. What we can be sure of is a few different things. First, the Soviet Union was communist, and that the USSR didn't dissolve in 1991 like it did in our timeline, and instead continued on until the Great War in 2077. Like in our timeline, it appears that the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union began to drift apart in what is known as the Sino-Soviet split. While this is greatly simplifying what is actually a relatively complex issue, the Sino-Soviet split came down to a couple different factors. In our world in 1959, the USSR supported an uprising of the Tibetan people against the Chinese, which greatly angered the Chinese. Mao Zedong in particular also felt that the USSR's leader at the time, Nikita Khrushchev, had capitulated to the United States during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And to top it all off, the Soviets backed India during the Sino-Indian War that occurred in 1962. While it's unclear whether these specific events happened in the Fallout universe, the Sino-Soviet split may explain why America is fighting the Chinese, as opposed to either both the Chinese and the USSR, or just the USSR by itself. Historically speaking, Nikita Khrushchev desired peaceful coexistence with the Western capitalist world, where Mao Zedong did not. This seems supported by the fact that Natalia Dubrovsky, who is one of the pre-made player characters from the very first Fallout, is the granddaughter of a Soviet diplomat who managed to secure a spot in Vault 13. Natalia's grandfather worked at the USSR consulate located in Los Angeles, implying that both countries might have at least had semi-neutral relations. However, with this said, there is some dialogue the player can have with Codsworth that reveals the Russians may have never really gotten along with the United States. Here's the exchange the sole survivor and Codsworth have at the very beginning of the game.
Sir? Here you are, sir. Now, I've been thinking, if something is amiss, your loved ones may simply be hiding from the Red Menace.
The Red Menace?
Why, the communists, of course. The Russians and the Chinese.
Or maybe evil leprechauns.
This exchange, along with Natalia's grandfather being in Vault 13, suggests that while the Soviets sought a peaceful coexistence, the Americans still propagandized against the country. There's a good possibility that Soviets may have similar propaganda that details the threats of Western capitalism, like we've seen with Chinese infiltrators in Fallout 3. There are a couple of other things that we know about the Soviet Union. We know that the United States never entered any direct conflict with the Soviet Union during the Resource Wars. Presumably, the Soviets fought in the war, but it's unclear to what extent the Soviets were involved. And we also know that a post-war Soviet Union exists, as Dukov is a Russian character from Fallout 3, and the Bobrov brothers from Fallout 4 may also be immigrants from the post-war Soviet Union as well. This would imply that people are living in the post-war Soviet Union, and they do appear to have some semblance of society like we have seen in all of the Fallout games so far. In our real world today, all of the European Union's countries combined have a larger population than the United States. Germany is the most populated country, followed by France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Spain. France is the largest country, followed by Spain, Sweden, and Germany, and overall, Germany appears to have the strongest economy, followed by the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Spain. While it's important that I mention that the United Kingdom recently voted to leave the European Union in our world, that's a discussion I will leave to you, as I don't feel like opening that can of worms. But I digress. Interestingly, most European nations don't have particularly large standing militaries compared to what you might see in countries like Russia, China, the United States, or India. Though I suppose it's worth mentioning that Russia, China, India, and the United States are super typical in the sense that these countries' militaries far exceed the capabilities of most other nations. Then again, in our real world, the European Union states are members of NATO, as is the United States, so that's probably a reason why. It is important to note that we don't know the status of NATO in the Fallout universe. However, it might be safe to assume that NATO disbanded as European nations eventually declared war on one another for the remaining resources in the region. Under NATO, disputes between European powers are to be resolved peacefully, and warfare violates that agreement. Russia, or the Soviet Union, is a little bit more complicated. According to Wikipedia in 1990, the Soviet Union had the world's second largest economy, the largest military in the world, and the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. If the Soviet Union didn't collapse in 1991, there's a possibility that the Soviet Union would still be a considerable power in the world. Even after the Soviet Union, Russia is still a fairly impressive country. Russia has the largest amount of mineral and energy resources in the world. In fact, Russia is supposedly the #1 producer of oil in the world, followed by Saudi Arabia, the United States, Iraq, and the People's Republic of China. And in current day, Russia has a very impressive military force, essentially being on the same level as the United States, China, and India in terms of military power. These factors alone are interesting to think about, especially since in the Fallout universe, the Soviet Union appears to be allied to or neutral with the United States. This is an educated guess, but based on what we know of China invading Alaska in the mid-2060s, it's possible that the Soviet Union's oil reserves may have been depleted by that point. At the same time, it seems likely that the Soviet Union would be at war trying to defend their oil supply from either the Chinese, the European Commonwealth, or America. Again, we don't really know a whole lot about the Soviet Union within the Fallout universe, so it's ultimately hard to say what the case is. Okay, so now you may be wondering, what happened to Europe after the Great War, and what would it be like in the post-war era? As we've discussed, European civil war broke out as countries fought over remaining resources. There's a strong possibility that much of the region was damaged by this civil war. Countries like Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom may have been in fairly bad shape without the infrastructure to create shelters to survive nuclear Armageddon. It's implied by one of Fallout 3 and Fallout 4's lead writers and designers, Emil Pagliarulo, that Allistair Tenpenny came to post-war America to seek his fortune. According to Fallout Gamepedia, Emil states that, and I quote, Allistair Tenpenny came to the capped wasteland from Great Britain to seek his fortune. So that alone tells you that the UK was also hit in the war. And if he came to the US to succeed, that says a lot about how screwed up Europe must be. This statement in particular indicates that Europe and the United Kingdom may be in pretty bad shape. Or at the time, Emil intended to convey to players of Fallout 3 that the rest of the world may be in worse shape than post-war America is. After all, we have several immigrants across all of the games. Some of them are from Ireland, some of them are from Russia, Eastern Europe, and of course Tenpenny was from the United Kingdom, which would have been a part of the European Commonwealth. I do see small communities forming in the European wasteland, as we've seen in all of the Fallout games so far, though I also think there's a possibility that conflict in Europe would continue on even after the Great War. Before World War II, Europe had essentially been in conflict for the greater part of the past 100 to 200 years. Of course, this ultimately peaked with the First and Second World Wars that left millions of people dead. Culturally speaking, Europe is relatively diverse, especially when you consider the different languages that are spoken between individual countries. You've got German, English, Spanish, Italian, Czech, Bulgarian, Finnish, Swedish, and several other languages spoken in the region. Keep in mind that this is roughly in an area that is slightly larger than the United States if we include parts of Russia. And since Russia and other Eastern European countries aren't included in the European Commonwealth and would be part of the Soviet Union, you essentially have a wider variety of individuals packed into a much smaller area than the United States. This would make communication between various inhabitants of Europe difficult if they don't learn to speak a foreign language. You're also probably wondering, what happened to Russia in the post-war era? Now, this one is also pretty hard to say, since all we have to go on is what we can infer from the very first Fallout. Since Natalia is of Soviet descent, and her grandfather requested a place in Vault 13, it's fairly safe to say that the Soviet Union was under nuclear threat. In fact, I would say that's pretty much guaranteed if you consider that Russia is currently the #1 exporter of oil in the world. I suppose it's worth mentioning that this may have changed sometime before the Resource Wars. Even still, it seems unlikely to me that Russia wouldn't have had to defend itself from China or possibly even the European Commonwealth. Or maybe the Soviet Union traded oil with the United States and European Commonwealth until they simply ran out of supply. I would say Russia's fate greatly depends on whether their oil supply was depleted or still remained as the bombs fell. If Russia was incapable of producing oil, I'd say that means their economy would have taken a major hit sometime before the Great War. In our real world, the Russian Federation's major economic strength is that oil and natural gas exports drive much of the economy's growth. The Soviet economy was also greatly dependent on oil export as well, and according to Wikipedia, oil and gas account for 16% of the Russian Federation's GDP and 70% of its total exports. Losing this could prove disastrous. If Soviet oil still existed during the resource wars, either America, the European Commonwealth, or China would want to go to war with them, especially if the pricing was unfair. And since it appears that this didn't happen, I'm willing to bet that their oil supplies were depleted. The lack of oil would greatly weaken the Soviet economy. However, it also stands to reason that it may make them less of a target during the resource wars. Assuming that no major conflicts erupt in Russia itself, perhaps like the United States, much of the Soviet Union wasn't torn apart by warfare like the European Commonwealth was during their civil war, or like China during the US invasion of China. This would mean that as the bombs fell, society in the Soviet Union may be relatively stable, and like we've seen in the United States, it's possible that Russia may have quite a few communities that remain after the war. What's unclear, though, is if they would grow into something as vibrant as the NCR from some of the Fallout games. Vault 15's existence led to the development of the NCR, and given the actions of Natalia's grandfather, there is a possibility that the Soviets had no Vault program at all. However, like Europe, some people would have to survive the nuclear blast, and they would form communities across the Russian wasteland. It's unclear, however, how sophisticated these societies would ultimately be. As I've said before, there's simply a lot that we don't know about other countries in the Fallout universe. While we can extrapolate somewhat based on things that happened during the pre-war era, there's still just a lot that we don't know. Something that would be nice is if future Fallout games allow us to meet more interesting people from these specific regions in the post-war era. I'd be curious to see more European and Russian NPCs in future games that could give us some idea as to what ultimately happened. After all, we know that the entire population of places like the United Kingdom, Russia, and Ireland aren't totally ghoulified, as we've seen human NPCs from those specific regions in the games. While actual Fallout games that take place in either of these regions are unlikely, especially since you don't have things like super mutants and the whole 1950s United States culture vibe, it would still be really interesting to experience a Fallout game in these areas. Fallout Moscow or Fallout New London could actually be pretty interesting and have their own assortment of interesting weapons to collect and NPCs to meet. Perhaps there is a Brotherhood of Steel-like organization that rules over post-war Moscow. Maybe like we've seen in the Metro franchise, many Muscovites escaped to the subway system to escape much of the radioactive fallout. Or maybe a similar situation may have played out in London too. Hopefully, Bethesda will give us some more insight into the rest of the world in future Fallout games. It would be awesome if they did so. Alright guys, that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, please be sure to leave a like and let me know, what do you think happened to the Europeans and the Russians during the events of the Fallout games? Do you think they're good? Do you think they're rebuilding society? Or do you think things are so bad and it's just a ghoul-infested wasteland? Anyway, let me know in the comments. As always, like this video if you liked it, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care and I'll see you all next time.